January 1942. A cold wind scrapes across a muddy training ground somewhere in Britain, where a line of Canadian infantrymen stands behind a low earth berm. In front of them, painted in dull grey, the hulking shell of a captured German tank squats in the drizzle, its armour pitted from months of live fire practice. Two soldiers wrestle a massive rifle into position on its bipod. It is longer than a man, with a slab-sided magazine and an awkward carry handle. The boy's anti-tank rifle. The weapon everyone calls the elephant gun. The weapon that veterans from France and Dunkirk have already branded useless. The gunner settles behind the cheek pad, shoulders tensed. His loader slams a 5-round magazine home with a metallic click. The instructor raises his arm. A moment of held breath. Then the range erupts. The enormous bolt slides forward, the trigger breaks. The shot cracks like artillery, the muzzle break belching flame and dust. Far down range, the .55-inch round punches into the side of the German hull with a harsh, echoing clang. The men blink, stunned by the violence of the recoil, and by the neat, fresh scar on the armour. To understand how this supposedly useless rifle reached this moment, and how Canadian hands turned it into a Panzer-Killer, we have to go back to where it began. In the late 1930s, long before Canadian gunners were scarring captured German armour on British ranges, the fear of tanks was already shaping weapons design in London and Birmingham. The First World War had ended with crude, lumbering machines crawling across mud. But by 1934 to 1935, British intelligence was reporting something different emerging in Germany. Faster, better-armed tanks, organised into mobile formations. Infantry officers knew that if their men had nothing to stop armour, a breakthrough could rip open an entire front. The answer, on paper, was simple. Give a small infantry team a weapon that could punch through tank armour at a few hundred yards. Not a heavy gun, not a complicated system, a rifle. The project that became the boys' anti-tank rifle took shape in this atmosphere. At Enfield and in associated factories, engineers scaled everything up, barrel, action, ammunition, until the weapon no longer looked like a rifle at all. It fired a 0.55-inch armour-piercing round from a 5-shot magazine, with a massive bolt and a huge muzzle device to tame the recoil. It weighed as much as a small child, and needed a bipod or fixed mounting to be used at all. When the weapon was finally adopted just before the war, it carried the name of Captain Henry C. Boys, the British officer closely associated with its development. It was never elegant, but on the test ranges, against the thin armour of early tanks and armoured cars, the big rifle did what it promised. At short and medium ranges, its hardened core could punch through side plates and engine compartments. As the British Empire mobilised, the Boys rifle went with it. Cases of the new anti-tank weapon crossed the Atlantic to Canada, where an expanding army needed something, anything that could give its infantry a theoretical answer to German armour. Canadian units training at home and in Britain were issued the same long, awkward rifles, drilled in range estimation, armour thickness, and aim for the weak spots. On paper, the equation was clear. Disciplined infantry, plus the boys' rifle, would keep enemy tanks at a respectful distance. But the war that arrived in 1940 did not respect paperwork, and on the roads and fields of France, the limits of this new weapon would be exposed with brutal speed. The campaign in France in 1940 became the first harsh test of the boys in real combat. On the firing ranges of Canada and Britain, instructors had shown neat penetration diagrams, side-view sketches of tanks, arrows marking weak spots, approved engagement distances. The message was simple. If Canadian or British infantry held their nerve and aimed correctly, the boys' rifle would crack open enemy armour. In France, the reality was less orderly. German armoured units moved fast, exploiting surprise and confusion. Their tanks were no longer the thin-skinned curiosities of the early 30s. Panzer IIIs and IVs were appearing with thicker frontal armour, reinforced mantlets, and better tactics. Infantrymen with boys' rifles often faced tanks at bad angles, at bad ranges, and under fire. Reports filtered back from units that had tried to stop advancing panzers with the big rifle and watched the rounds spark or bounce off. Gunners braced behind their bipods, endured the crushing recoil, and saw no visible effect on the tank that kept coming. The weapon's physical punishment, its blast, its weight, the bruising it left on shoulders and faces, only sharpened the disappointment. Very quickly a reputation formed. In mess halls, trench lines, and dispersed billets, the boys was spoken of as a jinx gun, a weapon that looked impressive, but could not be trusted against the tanks that mattered most. For many British and Canadian soldiers who had seen France, the rifle's name was tied to retreat, evacuation, and shattered expectations. Yet the story did not end there. German forces collected hundreds of captured boys' rifles from overrun depots and abandoned positions. They reissued them under their own designation, using them against light vehicles, bunkers, and soft targets. On captured test ranges, German officers evaluated the big Allied rifle and concluded that, within its limits, it remained dangerous, especially to thin side armour, armoured cars, and half-tracks. Back in Canada and Britain, training staffs and weapons boards took note of both sides of this experience. The boys could not defeat the newest tanks frontally at long range, but it could still disable light armour and stop the vehicles that made an armoured advance function. The problem was not only the rifle, it was how it was being used and what soldiers expected it to do. This realization drove a quiet shift. Canadian engineers began refining the design. Instructors rewrote lesson plans. Filmmakers and training officers looked for new ways to teach soldiers exactly how and when the big rifle could still kill. They were about to turn a disappointing weapon into a specialized tool, and in doing so, lay the groundwork for the shock that German officers would feel when the useless boy's rifle started halting their armour on the battlefield. When Canadian engineers and ordnance officers looked at the boy's rifle after France, they did not see a curse. They saw a list of flaws that could be adjusted one by one. In Toronto, at John Inglis and Company, the huge rifle moved from British drawings to Canadian production lines. The basic concept could not change. A long, heavy, bolt-action weapon firing a massive .55-inch cartridge, but almost everything around that core could be refined. The big, clumsy muzzle brake that spat blast in every direction was reshaped into a flatter, more efficient design that tamed recoil just enough to keep the shooter on target. The bipod, prone to sinking into soft ground or twisting under the weapon's weight, was strengthened and repositioned so the gunner could get a more stable firing platform. At the same time, Canadian and British ammunition specialists worked on the other side of the problem, the projectile itself. Early armour-piercing rounds that had struggled against thicker plates were joined by improved designs with harder cores and higher velocities. The rifle was never going to crack the nose of a late-war Panzer at long range, but at the distances that really mattered for infantry, under a few hundred yards, it could still punch into side armour, engine compartments and running gear if the shot was placed correctly. Slowly, the weapon that had felt like an unwieldy experiment began to feel more like a specialized tool. The Canadian-produced variant, with its modified fittings and more realistic sight settings, reflected what the weapon could actually do in the field. To Canadian instructors, this mattered as much as raw penetration figures. A rifle that matched its own doctrine, rather than a fantasy of what it might achieve, would be trusted more, fired more accurately, and used where it still had real effect. Doctrine itself shifted alongside the hardware. The boy's rifle was no longer presented as a magic answer to all tanks. It became what it had always been in technical papers, a platoon-level weapon for stopping light armoured vehicles and disrupting the movement of heavier ones. Training notes and lectures now emphasized the thickness of side armour versus front plates, the vulnerability of tracks, road wheels, fuel tanks and engine bays. On diagrams and sand tables, Canadian NCOs showed how a well-sighted boys' team could wait on a flank, letting the main tanks pass while targeting the thinner-skinned reconnaissance cars, half-tracks, and support vehicles that gave the armoured spearhead its eyes and mobility. Disable those, and even the heaviest German tank could be left blind, isolated, or physically blocked on a narrow road, piece by piece, through changes in metal, ammunition, and teaching. Canada was turning a disappointing symbol into a disciplined system. The rifle had not become stronger than German armor, but Canadian hands were learning how to make every remaining advantage count, and that meant looking beyond steel and diagrams, to the men who braced behind the bipods, and the officers who watched German columns react when their obsolete threat suddenly became very real. For the Canadians who actually fired it, the boys' rifle was never just a line on an equipment table, it was weight on their shoulders, bruises on their collarbones, and a very real question of whether the thing would do its job when enemy armor appeared. In infantry platoons, the weapon usually lived with a small team. One man carried the big rifle itself, another hauled extra magazines and ammunition boxes. Others might help move it or dig firing pits. On route marches through English lanes or Italian hillsides, the boys felt less like a sleek weapon and more like a punishment detail, its bulk catching on hedgerows and banging against helmets as the column moved. Yet on the range, and later in forward areas, those same men began to see what the rifle could do when everything aligned. In carefully prepared chutes, instructors had them engage old armoured cars, scrapped hulls and plates set at realistic angles. At close ranges, the armour-piercing rounds punched through where they were supposed to. Road wheels shattered. Edges of vision slits cracked. Fuel tanks split open. Gunners learned to ride the recoil, time their breathing, and work with a loader who could keep the awkward magazine topped up under stress. Mounted on universal carriers and like reconnaissance vehicles, the boys took on a different character. Now it was not just a static gun dug into an embankment, but a mobile stinger for flanking shots and quick ambushes. Canadian crews learned to use terrain, hedges and buildings to mask their approach, then swing the big rifle towards the sides or rear of German light armor, against half-tracks, scout cars and soft-skinned vehicles. A well-placed shot could stop movement, start fires, or force the crew to bail out. Psychology was as important as metal. The old stories from France still circulated. Many veterans remained skeptical. To counter this, Canadian training officers did more than lecture. They showed images, films, and step-by-step demonstrations of where to aim and what happened when shots landed correctly. One widely used training film, built for Canadian troops, turned tank killing into a sequence. Identify, choose the weak point, fire, observe, fire again. It deliberately portrayed German armor not as invincible monsters, but as machines with flaws that a disciplined crew could exploit. On the other side of the lines, German officers and vehicle commanders did not dismiss Allied anti-tank rifles entirely. Reports from various fronts noted damaged half-tracks, pierced engine compartments, and crews wounded by spalling when large-caliber bullets struck thin plates. Captured boys' rifles were catalogued, test-fired, and occasionally pressed into secondary service. For German reconnaissance units operating in lighter vehicles, the knowledge that even an obsolete enemy weapon could cripple their machine at close range was an uncomfortable reality. Thus, by the middle years of the war, a quiet tension existed. Many Allied soldiers still joked bitterly about the boys, yet Canadian specialists, gunners and engineers had reshaped how and where it was used. German officers, for their part, could no longer treat it as harmless background noise. Under the right conditions, in the right hands, it was once again a genuine threat. All of these threads, hardware, training, morale, and enemy perception, would converge the moment a Canadian boys team, positioned exactly as the manuals described, finally faced a real German column on the move. It happened not in a grand set-piece battle, but in the kind of small, vicious encounter that rarely makes maps or headlines. A Canadian carrier platoon had been told to cover a narrow stretch of road on the edge of a ruined village. The ground around it was broken by walls, orchards, and drainage ditches. Terrain that favoured an ambush. Intelligence reports warned that German reconnaissance elements were probing forward, feeling for weak spots with armoured cars and half-tracks before heavier tanks committed. For the Canadian officers and NCOs, this was exactly the scenario the new doctrine had been built around. The heavy anti-tank guns were further back. The boys' rifles, now mounted on carriers and dug into concealed positions near the road, were the first line meant to slow, blind, or block whatever came. In the half-light of early morning, the sound arrived before the vehicles did. a distant clatter of tracks, the harsher growl of engines working in low gear, the metallic rattle of loose equipment. The Canadian teams, already in position, stayed motionless. Gunners lay behind their big rifles, knees braced, shoulders tight against the padded rests. Loaders kept magazines close at hand, counting quietly to steady their breathing. Through a break in a hedge, the first German vehicle slid into view, a light armoured car, thinly plated but fast, its turrets scanning left and right. Behind it, the taller outline of a half-track followed. Infantry hunched in the back. Further shapes moved in the haze beyond, more vehicles, possibly tanks. But in the Canadian plan, they did not matter yet. The order was simple and familiar. Let the point vehicle come close. Ignore the heavy silhouettes beyond. Aim for the lead machines that controlled pace and direction. At less than 100 yards, with the armoured car angled just enough to expose its side, the first boy's rifle fired. The recoil slammed into the gunner's shoulder. The muzzle brake hurled dust and leaves into the air. For a heartbeat, the vehicle seemed untouched. Then a dark splash snapped out from its flank as the round punched through the thinner armour over the engine bay. Smoke. Then a lick of flame rolled from the vents. The car lurched, skidded towards the ditch, and stopped dead across the road. Almost immediately, a second Canadian position opened up on the half-track behind it. Another heavy shot crashed out, aimed low at the front wheels and exposed running gear. Metal shattered. The vehicle slewed sideways, its driver fighting the controls before losing control entirely. In seconds, the narrow road that had been clear was blocked by two crippled machines. German infantry scrambled for cover. Men bailed out of the burning armoured car and half-track, diving behind walls and into ditches, suddenly without their rolling protection. Vehicles further back jammed to a halt, unable to push through the wrecks. Whatever heavier armour was in the column found its advance stalled by the very light vehicles supposed to lead and shield it. From the Canadian side, there was no sense of miracle. The boys' teams had done exactly what months of revised training told them to do. Wait, choose the right targets, and fire into the parts of German machines that could still be hurt. But in the sudden chaos on that narrow road, in the column of smoke, the trapped vehicles, and the urgent German radio traffic, one thing was clear. The rifle that many had written off as useless against real armour had just stopped a German armoured thrust cold. Not by destroying a main battle tank, but by ripping the eyes and legs out from under the formation. What Canadian officers already understood from tests and training, German commanders would now have to confront in their own reports and briefings. The German reports that followed engagements like this, the language was cool and technical, but the frustration still showed through. The lead armoured car had been lost to heavy rifle fire at close range. The half-track behind it had suffered damage to its running gear and front plates, again from concentrated fire by a large-caliber weapon. Neither loss, on its own, resembled a decisive tank duel, yet the effect on the mission was undeniable. The road was blocked, the column stalled, and the intended probe had been reduced to a confused exchange of small arms and artillery in a place and time not of the Germans' choosing. For officers reviewing these reports at company and battalion level, the pattern was familiar. On multiple fronts, Allied anti-tank rifles, Polish, British, Canadian and others, had failed to keep pace with the heaviest new tanks, but they still inflicted real damage on lighter vehicles. The Canadian use of their modified boys' rifles fit the same pattern, but with a notable twist. The fire had come from well-sighted positions, clearly aimed at critical points on the lead vehicles, and coordinated to create an instant roadblock. This was not random defiance. It was a taught method. German technical staff already knew the boys' rifle by then. They had test-fired captured examples, measured muzzle velocity, and calculated penetration tables. They had issued their own stocks under a new designation, assigning them to second-line units, airfield defences and security formations. On paper, it was an obsolete anti-tank weapon, still useful against light armour and structures, but no longer a serious threat to the main battle tanks that had defined early campaigns. Yet the ambushes that Canadian and other Commonwealth units carried out forced a reconsideration. The problem was not the rifle alone. It was what could be done with it when the enemy chose the time, angle, and distance of engagement. A light armoured car that could shrug off rifle and machine gun bullets became vulnerable again when a 0.55-inch armour-piercing round struck its flank at under 100 yards. A half-track that provided mobility and firepower became a liability when it was immobilised across a narrow route. In post-action discussions, German officers adjusted their emphasis. Reconnaissance elements needed more infantry screens, more cautious use of roads bordered by ditches and hard cover, more suppressive fire on likely ambush points. Light vehicles were to be kept moving, not allowed to loiter in confined spaces where a hidden gun team could pick its moment. And wherever intelligence suggested that the enemy still fielded heavy anti-tank rifles in quantity, commanders were reminded that even obsolete weapons could shut down movement if they were allowed to dictate the geometry of the fight. The boy's rifle had not suddenly become a wonder weapon. Its rounds still could not reliably penetrate the frontal armour of late-war German tanks. Crews still dreaded its recoil. Many frontline soldiers still swore at it under their breath. But in the notebooks and briefings of officers who dealt with the consequences of blocked roads and burning armoured cars, it reappeared in a new light, not as a failed experiment, but as a persistent hazard, especially in Canadian hands that used it exactly as it had been redesigned and retrained to be used. For those Canadian gunners and carriers who had staked their lives on that doctrine, this shift in enemy perception was invisible. They saw only that the column had stopped, the vehicles were burning, and their platoon had survived another day. The larger story, the slow, methodical transformation of a maligned rifle into a specialized tool that could still upset German plans, would only become clear when the war moved on and the next generation of weapons began to replace it. By the middle of the war, the limits of the boy's rifle were no longer in doubt. German tanks had grown heavier, Panzer IVs with thickened frontal plates, self-propelled guns with low silhouettes and angled armour. And then the new generation of Panthers and Tigers began appearing at the front. Against these machines, a .55-inch solid shot, even from close range, could not be counted on to do more than chip paint or damage fittings. Canadian officers understood this long before the last boy's rifle left a frontline unit. They saw the weapon now as part of a layered system, not the centerpiece of anti-tank defense. Medium and heavy guns, the 6-pounder and 17-pounder, formed the backbone. Mines, artillery, and even air power joined the net. What Canada and the other Commonwealth armies still needed was a man-portable weapon that could truly pierce the armour of late-war tanks at the distances infantry actually fought. The answer came in the form of a very different device, the Piat. Where the boys relied on kinetic energy, a hardened shot driven at high speed, the Piat used a shaped charge warhead. Instead of trying to punch through armour by sheer impact, it focused explosive energy into a narrow jet capable of burning through thick steel at close range. The launch system was brutal and awkward in its own way, but in combat the results were undeniable. A well-placed Piat bomb could hole a tank that no anti-tank rifle could reasonably touch. As Piats arrived in Canadian units, the boys began to slide down the equipment lists. New establishments reduced its role, first in assault platoons and front-line infantry companies, then in reconnaissance and secondary positions. In some formations it lingered on vehicles and in static defences, still valued for knocking out light armour, trucks and fortified positions. A heavy bullet that could shred a machine gun nest or pierce a wall at range was still useful, even if it no longer dictated tank tactics. For the soldiers who had grown up with the big rifle, the transition was both practical and symbolic. The lessons drilled into them with the boys did not disappear. They carried over into Piat training and beyond. Aim for weak points. Let the enemy come close. Choose ground that forces them into bad angles. The mental picture of armour as a collection of vulnerable systems, tracks, optics, engines, fuel, had been built during the boys' era, and now shaped how Canadians fought with more modern weapons. Slowly, quietly, the reputation of the old rifle settled into its final form. It was no longer the great hope of pre-war planners, nor the curse of France. It had become what it truly was, an interim answer, pushed to its limits, then replaced when technology and the battlefield moved past it. And yet, even as newer weapons took over the task of killing tanks, the boys still had a few chapters left to write in Canadian and Commonwealth service. In the later years of the war, The boys' rifle spread outward along the edges of the conflict, even as it retreated from the hardcore of anti-tank fighting. Some Canadian and Commonwealth units kept it as an anti-vehicle and anti-materiel weapon. In Italy, Northwest Europe, and more remote theatres, heavy bullets from the boys were turned against trucks loaded with supplies, field gun tractors and fortified firing points. A single shot that could smash through an engine block or punch into a masonry corner still had value when the enemy relied on narrow roads, stone farmhouses, and hastily prepared strongpoints. In certain specialized roles, the rifle remained strangely well suited. Airfield defenses could use it to damage parked aircraft or incoming light vehicles. Patrols in rough country could employ it to collapse cover or break up obstacles at ranges beyond ordinary small arms. The same characteristics that had once made it feel like a crude answer to the tank problem now made it a flexible tool wherever thick steel was not the main opponent. As the war ended, large stocks of boys' rifles were left in depots and storage yards. Some were scrapped, others were sold, passed to allies, or kept for experimental work. Armourers and engineers explored conversions, rebarreling the massive actions to fire more common 50 caliber rounds, or adapting them for long-range anti-materiel roles. These experiments did not turn the boys into a standard sniper's rifle, but they showed that the basic idea, a portable, man-handled weapon that bridged the gap between infantry arms and heavy guns, still had appeal. For Canadian veterans, the memory of the boys was complex. Many remembered the bruises and headaches, the long marches with the awkward weight digging into shoulders, and the early stories of rounds bouncing off tank fronts. Others remembered the satisfying, ringing impact when a shot struck a half-track just right, or the sight of a blocked road where light German vehicles lay wrecked in exactly the way instructors had promised. After the war, surviving examples found their way into museums, armories, and private collections. On display racks, stripped of grime and camouflage paint, the rifles looked even more oversized, like relics from an experimental stage of warfare. Visitors reading the small plaques might see only a failed anti-tank rifle, overtaken by rockets and modern guns. The full story, the shift from disappointment to disciplined use, and the shock it caused when used correctly, required the memories and records of those who had seen columns stopped by obsolete rifles in Canadian hands. In that gap between reputation and reality lies the true legacy of the boys in Canadian service, and the reason German officers could no longer afford to laugh at it. In the long history of warfare, the boys' rifle is a minor character. It did not decide campaigns, topple regimes, or dominate post-war designs. Yet its story in Canadian hands reveals something important about how armies and people adapt under pressure. On paper, the weapon began as a simple equation: a big rifle to stop early tanks. On the roads of France in 1940, that equation failed. Armour thickened, tactics evolved, and a weapon that had been meant to reassure infantry instead became a symbol of frustration. For many who carried it in those early months, the boys would always be tied to retreat and disappointment. Canada could have left it there, written the rifle off and waited for something better. Instead, engineers, instructors and soldiers treated it as a problem to be solved, rather than a myth to be believed or discarded. They improved the hardware. They corrected the doctrine. They told the truth. This rifle would not kill every tank, but it could still tear the heart out of a German column if used at the right place, at the right range, against the right targets. That honesty turned a useless weapon into a reliable tool. It also forced the enemy to adjust. German officers might still label the boys as obsolete in technical tables, but field reports told a different story. Blocked roads, burning armoured cars, stalled probes. The threat lay not in the rifle's name, but in the discipline of the Canadians behind it. In the end, heavier guns and shaped charge weapons took over the anti-tank role. The boys faded into museums and training manuals. Its legacy is not a miracle of engineering, but a quieter lesson, that even flawed tools, in the hands of a force willing to study, adapt, and accept reality, can still change the shape of a battlefield, and force an opponent to look again at what they thought they already understood. If this story resonated with you, consider liking the video. It supports our work and allows us to bring more carefully researched Second World War histories to light. Subscribe if you value factual, grounded war documentaries, free of exaggeration, focused on real events and real people. We also invite you to leave a comment below and share where you're watching from. History connects us across borders and generations, and this community reflects that. Thank you for being here, and thank you for remembering.